Let me give you a condensed narrative of the conquest of the Americas as it was taught to me. The Spanish arrived in Mesoamerica, and through a mix of technological advantage and native alliance, they managed to do a bit of divide and a bit of conquer. Disease was mentioned, but as a later separate thing, after the rapid conquests. In earlier tellings, a lot of emphasis was put on the idea that Cortés was treated as an embodiment of Quetzalcoatl, but that faded away by high school. As I was taught, the native alliance was never heavily emphasized, but it was a repeat element, be it the Aztec or the Incan empires and their desolation. As for North America, what with Thanksgiving and all that, well, keep in mind the part of the story where the Native Americans taught the Puritans how to grow food, because it's going to come back later in a weird way. Now this is what leads us to the core of this video. Europa Universalis is a game that portrays history, seeks to turn it into gameplay, and in doing so is built on certain understandings of history. Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs and Steel is one such understanding. It is a popular science book that has, true to its pop nature, presented the world with an instantly consumable, though factually flimsy narrative. This is not another pop history bad video. I have a different point in mind. In short, we should be open to new and more complex understandings of history, bringing in new evidence, and throwing away old generalizations lacking finer detail, even if it's just to bring in newer, more evidenced generalizations that also lack finer detail. The upcoming Project Caesar is an unnamed game being teased by Paradox Interactive, which at this point is all but confirmed to be Europa Universalis 5. It has a pointed interest in removing as much abstraction as it can from the experience of simulating history. Given that, EU5 has an opportunity to infuse a bit of nuance into the experience that Europa Universalis as a series has always lacked. Paradox Interactive's games are not a treatise on history. They do not count among their sources 200 books to cover the centuries of gameplay. Their intent is not to simulate history as it happened, but to offer a recognizable facsimile in which history can happen. And so it falls to us to ask what we recognize the game as, what a given Paradox game is drawing inspiration from. You might be tempted to just say, history, duh. But as I've gone over in excess in previous videos, history is a meeting of the known facts of the past and the lens of the present. Where is EU4 getting its history of the Reformation? Do they synthesize their own lens? Probably not. And that's fine. Again, game first, history second. But to just take it as correct, or default even, is to drop the line of inquiry with an unsatisfying answer. If we accept this as a game, a thing of media, an interpretation of history, just as much as a retelling, an adaptation, if you will, then it is in our interests to understand what inspires it. And when looking at colonialism and its portrayal in EU4, something pulls me towards Guns, Germs and Steel as an inspiration. I don't know, maybe it's the Guns, Drums and Steel music pack they did? For added context, Europa Universalis is, in its latest iteration, the history of the world fleshed out in varying degrees across regions and eras between 1444 and 1821. It tells the story of the Renaissance, colonialism, the 80 Years' War and Reformation, the rise of the Ottomans, the decline of the Ming, and whatever story you can get it to tell. Vietnam colonial theocracy, Hungary-led Hungaro-Austrian Empire, you name it. But fundamentally, it is still a story that will have core beats, so to speak. There is a cast of nations, a timeline of events, and a limited range of actions to be taken, actions that are encouraged. These core beats help structure the game as a simulation of the Great Divergence. The Great Divergence is best explained via a question. Why did Europe conquer the world? What happened so that they could? Guns, Germs and Steel is centered in part on the question of the Great Divergence, seeking to answer it. EU4 is seeking to simulate it. That is the plot of the game, in one sense. I've spilled ink before on the subjects of EU4, colonialism, and the ability to do bad guy historical actions in these games, and I won't retread a lot of that here, but I do think it's important to lay out the key double-bind Paradox faces in depicting history. Or, well, there's two of them, really. 1. It is a game, but it is history, and it has to balance being true, to some degree, with being gameplay. This is partly settled. It's clear that Paradox approaches these games as games first, history second. From this, the second one. It is history, but you do it through gameplay. It thus, among other gameplay actions, either makes historical atrocity not an option, or makes committing atrocity into gameplay. And of course, no game studio wants to have the defining element of their design be something people constantly ponder over, something that puts them a stone's throw away from discourse. That is, of course, why the World War II game Hearts of Iron doesn't even touch the Holocaust. And again, that's got arguments for and against it, for how that's a whitewash, how it's a clean Wehrmacht enablement, and how it would be impossible to do justice in a game that's supposed to be fun, like most games are, and how, in my view, it's probably the only smart option as a company trying to sell games, certainly the safest. I'm obligated to say here explicitly yet briefly that I'm not calling the games bad or saying you can't enjoy them and be a good person, or saying Paradox is evil or anything remotely like that. If you feel judged, I'm sorry, but you're also probably priming yourself to hear something I'm not saying. But to make games of war, of colonial enterprise, is really still modeling atrocities implicitly. What makes EU4 feel different? What changes things with Hearts of Iron? I'd say it's two things: our chronologically longer distance from the events of EU4 and our historical framing of the events of EU4, of the Great Divergence as some manner of inevitability. It follows then that Paradox has never made a Cold War era game. The chronological distance is much shorter, and rather than a loose historical framing, we have living memory and a general understanding that colonialism had victims, had very direct consequences for people still alive today. The closer history games get to the present, the more the interpretation of events unavoidably transforms into topical social commentary. But that's not to say depictions of the past are neutral. It is with this idea of distance and divergence in mind that we look to EU4 and its historical depiction of colonialism in the oft-fashioned New World. Guns, Germs and Steel's presentation of Divergence is a likely source of inspiration for the series, though certainly not the only one. A blog post by Professor Brett Devereaux, linked below, offers a different perspective on Guns, Germs and Steel's relation to EU4 alongside other pretty clear inspirations, so you can read that if you'd like to round out your understanding of what informed EU4's base design. With that said, EU4 can't actually simulate much of what Guns, Germs and Steel is about. The book explores said divergence via several lenses, including the lenses of population distribution, demography, pathogens, climate, and societal collapses, things that EU4 cannot mechanically include or model. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that one mechanic is so abstract in its modeling that it stumbles into the worst of Diamond's presumptions while also falling short of consistently standing for anything at all. That mechanic is called development. Europa Universalis 5 promises to diverge from its predecessor with the inclusion of population modeling. Now, that may prompt you to question what this game about history had in place of population and demographics before. What does EU4 use to represent the density of cities and the like, to distinguish Cairo from the Sahara? To put it simply, EU4 has a system called development, that at its core represents the value of a province in terms of tax, goods, and manpower. In turn, those three values represent everything from population to some measure of infrastructure to natural resources to resource extraction capability, and it doesn't draw clear lines for any of those things. Development and its abstraction reflects very poorly onto history. As Brett notes in the same post I listed before, and as I've said elsewhere, monarch points are the only currency for improving development, and they are themselves abstract. They come predominantly from leaders and advisors, and this creates a disjointed feedback loop that undercuts the historical motive of things like colonialism. Let's draw up a hypothetical to explain. Say I play as the Dutch and I colonize large portions of the New World. The trade goods and merchants they provide lead me to abundant wealth, but unless I invest that wealth specifically in advisors, there's no meaningful way that the wealth impacts the development of my country. At no point do colonies provide anything for my development of the homeland. I can buy buildings, but those are distinct from development. If development means things like urbanization and population, then it's rather odd that the concentration of wealth via colonies has no impact on that unless I hire and increase funding for some guys. This is necessary to bring up because development and its abstract nature haunt any discussion of what colonizable land is, why it's worth nabbing, and how population is even presented in EU4. Development in uncolonized land is not representative of population, but of the land's immediate potential. If it represented population, then using the Attack Natives button would lower development the way the Exploit button does. That example alone shows how drastic the transformation to EU5 will be. Indeed, when we look back at EU4, the absence of population will probably feel the most archaic. Let's pair the introduction of population in EU5 with another of its changes, the timeline. Timeline is simple. The start date has been pushed back to 1337. Now this means the game will, in its timeline, include the Black Plague. And since it's now going to model population, that means disease and population decline will be a factor, a mechanic. The moment I learned this, I could only wonder one thing. How will they portray the Americas? In the face of beginning in 1337, we have over 100 years of pre-Columbian history to play out. In the face of disease and population decline, we have to thus face the depopulation of the Americas as gameplay. We have to face the importation of population and everything that means, from colonists to slaves, as gameplay. It has to be different, and it will be less clean a story. But population isn't the only thing to model, and is by no means a guarantee that EU5 will change some of the more core elements that, for obvious reasons, favor simulating Europe's experience of the era. EU4 is fundamentally structured around the European experience when it comes to government, states, colonization, trade pathing, expansion, discovery, monuments, the value of gold, and the phrase New World conceptually. Even with bespoke mechanics, native gameplay is always built on a foundation that presumes European gameplay to be the core. In that light, many mechanics do not suit New World Nation gameplay, and in another, I see a shadow cast by Guns, Germs and Steel. And I wonder if it will reach into EU5. It's time to talk about the aardvark in the room. Last time I took a swing at pop history, I mentioned that on occasion reading a book like this, you hit a snag of sorts. My examples were overemphasizing Robert the Bruce's Norman nature and the use of dialogue tags when telling stories about Stalin. For this book, for Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs and Steel, I knew it had a questionable reputation going into it, but okay, just bear with me. In a section laying out the genuinely fascinating question of how did we even start domesticating certain plants, Diamond, for no reason other than I guess trying for flourish or a word count, decides that it's pertinent to describe an aardvark. His description is, quote, a hyena-like animal. And I know it's petty to litigate the finer details of medium-sized land mammals and whatever, and not the point of the book, but like, what a weird way to take me out of it. If you don't know, aardvarks are nocturnal mammals with long snouts that eat exclusively ants and termites, and this one specific melon, oft described as a cucumber. If you want for a comparison, anteaters are right there. The point is less haha, throw the book out, it made a poor comparison in an anecdote, and more how much of the book requires trust in his confident tone, and that moments like this shake trust. Does this mean Jared Diamond is not credible in his discussion of everything? No. But one issue with the book is that it really does attempt to be a book of everything. My copy cover blurb is a short history of everybody for the last 13,000 years. And true to that, if you asked a reader what it's about, they might say it's general history, anthropology, biology, the evolution of agriculture, the transformation of technology, and it does touch all those things. And the expertise and subsequent quality of arguments is not consistently maintained. Diamond himself is a biologist, so Guns and Steel are already out of his wheelhouse a bit. And on that note, the title of the book makes it sound like he's saying it all comes down to guns, germs, and steel, when, in practice, his conclusion heavily centers on geography and a theory known as environmental determinism. But we'll get there. Narrowing down to my interests, does the aardvark comment reflect upon his narrative of the decline of the Native American empires? No, but it does mean he's just saying things. It invites scrutiny. If you're reading the chapters as he's laid them out, you'll already have run into some erroneous history by that point in the book anyhow. Chapter 3, Collision at Cajamarca, gets some very basic things wrong about the encounter between Pizarro and the Incan emperor Atahualpa, which I put in quotes because his rule was in question. Now, the main problem with this section is that this moment is described as a decisive turning point in history, the moment the Inca had their fate sealed. It is, quote, the most dramatic moment in European Native American relations. He goes on to describe Atahualpa as a god-king ruler with, quote, absolute authority over his subjects who obeyed even the orders he issued from captivity. which is at direct odds with the whole Civil War thing. A secondary problem with this section is that it argues the Incan destruction was inevitable due to European technological superiority. These two issues are, themselves, partly at odds. Diamond proposes that technology was the edge Spain needed to crush the Mesoamericans and Inca. But if technology was the major factor, if it was indeed guns, then surely the Maya, last to be conquered, wouldn't have held out for nearly 200 years post-contact. Tenochtitlan fell in 1521, but the Itza lasted until 1697, to the reign of the famously inbred Charles II of Spain. The Maya nearly outlasted the entire Habsburg rule of Spain, which spanned from 1515 until 1700. Obviously, technology made individual battles easy, but wars aren't all battles. They're logistics and garrisons and travel and numbers. Guns and steel, of course, had some impact, but tech and its impact on a given battle pales in the ability to 1. Get across the ocean, and 2. Supply people who are, again, across the ocean. Was this down to a decisive moment, or was it inevitable? The conquest wasn't just a clean sweep, a stack wipe in EU4 terms. There are factors that appear and disappear from Diamond's work depending on the point he's making. In the tech section, it's all about the small Spanish force beating the huge Incan army. In the germs section, it's about how obliterated morale was due to the rapid spread of smallpox among Incan troops. These factors don't intertwine, they're isolated towards conflicting points. And going further, Guns, Germs and Steel forgets the natives who fought the natives. It, with abstraction, implies the Inca or the Aztecs were vanquished as a unitary people. But again, the reality of the event involved armies of non-Aztec Mesoamericans, non-Incan Andeans, fighting with the Spanish against their respective empires. In one sentence, he says, the Spanish accomplished something we can hardly imagine today, a victory of 168 Spaniards against an army 500 times their size with no losses. And in the next paragraph, he mentions native allies, but only in order to dispel their relevance in favor of technology. Call it calculated, call it genius, call it divide and conquer, whatever you wish, but the involvement of native allies should not be minimized. Now, as for germs and population, I'll let an anecdote from Diamond himself explain the changed nature of historical thought. When I was young, American school children were taught that North America had originally been occupied by only about 1 million Indians. That low number was useful in justifying the white conquest of what could be viewed as an almost empty continent. However, archaeological excavations and scrutiny of descriptions left by the very first European explorers on our coasts now suggests an initial number around 20 million Indians. The main killers were Old World germs to which the Indians had never been exposed. By the way, the rough estimate is now closer to 60 million, but I won't hold that against a book from 1997. Certain estimates before then, according to a cited chart on Wikipedia, sometimes put the number as low as 8 million and as high as 100 million, so there's clearly been changes and differing methods. What has, however, most ardently been discussed is not that disease was a factor, but how much of a sole factor it was, and with it, questions of European culpability. Indeed, this is where Diamond's latter sentence positions him. He does not put any emphasis on things that enhance the spread of disease, like dwindling food supply, things that were, in places like the Caribbean, a consequence of colonialism, and in places like Mesoamerica, a consequence of war. And this is sort of a microcosm of Diamond's broader stance with respect to racism and imperialism. He, as will be emphasized soon, centers in his book a dispelling of racist theories for the Divergence, but the way he does so also tends to run cover for imperialism. I'd like to substantiate my reading of his work by calling on some external critiques. There is one critique of this book that saw publication in an academic journal titled F*** Jared Diamond, which, while a bit inflammatory and of course less professional, is cathartic to people for a reason. Now, if you did see the last video on pop history, you'll know I sort of wished academics would step up and call out Montefiore more. This is largely the tone of responses to Guns, Germs and Steel. As one review puts it, performing vigorous intellectual damage control. The key problem the reviewer has is Diamond's casual but insistent revival of a concept known as environmental determinism. In my words, environmental determinism is the argument that history went the way it did because of geography, that Europe had the ideal conditions to become what it did, or more so that the rest of the world suffered from less than ideal conditions. If you're just listening to someone explain environmental determinism, you might find it rather neutral. It's hardly controversial to argue that the environment shaped the trajectory of civilizations. But let's look at a review by J.M. Blout for some help with this one. Blout emphasized the continuity of Eurocentrism and environmental determinism, and how determinism has at different times taken a religious or scientific form, with the former positioning the Europeans as God's chosen, and the latter dipping into race science. Keep that last part in mind. To quote Blout,
"There is nothing wrong with an argument that, validly, shows how some environmental quality was useful to Europeans and helped in their development. The argument becomes environmentalistic if it either claims that an environmental quality existed in Europe when it did not exist there, or claims that an environmental quality was an important cause of European progress when the truly important causes were cultural, or, most crucially, makes a false comparison with the environments of other places, and then proclaims the differences between European and non-European environments explain, or help to explain, the differential rise of Europe."
A theme of Diamond's work is the careful selection and omission of examples in order to construct a vast and valid narrative. Blout notes Diamond makes arguments on the nature of certain crops and their nutritional value and domestic potential, and when they were domesticated using either outdated sources or by conflating earliest known with outright earliest, irrespective of issues that hamper archaeology in more tropical regions, like enhanced decay. Another such example is how difficulties to diffusion of technology, goods, etc. is selectively invoked. Eurasia is taken as a given to be diffuse, because again, geographic hurdles are ignored. North-south, going from temperate to tropical, is insurmountable to Diamond, while mountains and deserts that impede the east-west diffusion of Eurasia do not, in that moment, register. Where environmental determinism is the most pervasive narrative of Guns, Germs and Steel, the final line of the book prior to the epilogue serves us Diamond's actual intent, dispelling racism from the Divergence argument using determinism. It reads, "In short, Europe's colonization of Africa had nothing to do with differences between European and African peoples themselves, as white racists assume. Rather, it was due to accidents of geography and biogeography, in particular to the continent's different areas, axes, and suites of wild plant and animal species. That is, the different historical trajectories of Africa and Europe stem ultimately from differences in real estate." We can take that last line and extrapolate it a bit, towards meaning Europe versus the global south, more or less. Every place that Diamond has marked as having some manner of difficult biogeography. The racist supremacist argument that Diamond is refuting hasn't had much acceptance in academia. I imagine he didn't assume as much when he wrote the book and was seeking to educate or reason away harmful pop ideas more than anything, and in that way perhaps the book succeeded. But remember Blout? Race and environmental determinism were once partners. And in that light, Diamond's use of determinism to oppose a blunter racism feels more like modernizing a maligned theory than it does actually advancing the subfield of geography. It didn't really wash over me just how much Diamond commits to this determinism until the epilogue. Before reading that, I could sort of see why there's occasional arguments about how much he believes in it. Determinism ends up being the end point of a few chapters, but the chapters themselves weave through a lot of different points before landing there. In an effort to prove his ultimate thesis, that racial difference is not the reason Europe succeeded, he says this: "These tests confirm that the same ancestral peoples either ended up extinct or returned to living as hunter-gatherers or went on to build complex states, depending on their environment." He takes certain specific examples of migrant populations, of European and Chinese farmers transplanted to a new environment, and makes the case that they adapted to that environment. So much so that they'd fully transform or abandon the societal structure they knew, and that just doesn't bear out all that often. This is, I find, a paramount example of cherry-picked historical anecdotes from his 13,000 years of history being used to make a tremendous claim. In isolation, this claim only needs to meet colonialism to fall apart. That said, if you isolate the epilogue, I think Diamond comes off far worse. I suspect, given the phrasing of many critiques I've seen online, big, small, academic, layperson, etc., that this epilogue sticks with people the most or gets passed around the most as the target for frustration with him. And while I'd normally call that irresponsible, given the whole book preceding it, It is Diamond crystallizing his beliefs, and it comes with statements that aren't necessarily substantiated in the preceding book. It comes with statements that fall apart if you think about them for like 20 seconds. It's here he implies the America lacked for a wide range of domesticable plants, which, hey, remember that pilgrim story I said would come back up? Or like, the origin of corn and tomatoes and potatoes and yams? It comes with the assertion that America had more geographic hurdles given its north-south orientation than Eurasia's east-west axis, which is curious to me because North America is pretty vast in an east-west way, but also Eurasia has monumental mountain ranges and deserts and deep tropics between places. It's not modest, as he puts it. Frankly, it feels like the section with reasoned arguments that still have faults in them is a bit milder in its conclusions than the force of the epilogue, and that's likely where the schism in perception of the man and his work come from. While Diamond's work is anti-racist in its efforts to explain history as something more than just the supremacy of Europe for genetic racial reasons or whatever, I fear that it creates the appearance of a safe and reasoned position of colonialism. Not apologia, but how do I frame this? Support? Not in the sense of being pro-Spanish, but in the sense of pinning the victories on an earned edge, guns and steel. He, with a painfully casual tone, asserts that the literacy of the Spanish versus the illiteracy of the Inca was why the Incan emperor was captured for being too naive. History becomes inevitable in that lens, and to some degree, that lessens the sense of violence. It's almost Darwinist. There's no agency. The conquest by the Spanish is not a choice, it's a scientific outcome. This is where contention with his work really creeps in, and funnily enough, it's where the book accidentally aligns with the whole Darwinist nature of EU4 as a simulation of states that only act because they can. I've seen critique that centers the passivity by which he describes the Spanish conquests, as though he has a responsibility to explicitly condemn the conquests, and frankly, I'm not so confident that he needs to condemn them, nor substantiate an argument that a feudal society built through something as bloody as the Reconquista would do what it did in the Americas. I don't think that actually becomes a question of agency in that moment. He's not saying Pizarro was destined to be a bastard and is thus absolved. He's saying he had the capacity to succeed at it. Drawing a line between an absence of agency, a depiction of cold inevitability, and an explanation of potentiality is tricky to do here, and possibly where a lot of the interpretive dispute over Diamond comes from. And at the risk of looking like I've gone in circles here, this is the end point. Diamond does ultimately affirm an idea of passive inevitability. He ultimately neglects cultural forces like imperialism, taking as a given the desire towards conquest, the use of guns and steel. Further, he has an awful habit of using the word naive to describe the Native Americans who fought the Spanish without really clarifying what he means, and even if he did, I doubt it would stand to scrutiny. Contextually, the best read is that they didn't understand the weapons of the Spanish, but sometimes he makes it feel like there's some noble savage stuff going on, and that's weird. And all of this presumes, in a way that might feel familiar, that conquest is, barring some minor rebellion after, a singular action, a one-and-done battle. History, for Diamond, when it comes to the conquest of the Americas, imagines the triumph over the Inca as a singular contiguous victory, and does not question what empire building from there on entails. And it could be argued that that's outside the scope of his book. But is it? The book is so broad already, and why did Europe manage to take land is no more an important question than how they held on to it. In failing to recognize this, Diamond effectively erases people from history, in a way that feels very map-gamey. Flawed in its own ways, some with hindsight, some the moment the book came out, its narrative is one that paints an imperfect picture, one we can move past. The point is less to condemn a book, to say it's bad and laugh, and more to note that it has had a heavy impact on popular perceptions, and that the record needs correcting now. And there's no shame in learning something new. I once told people that Pizarro's capture of the Incan emperor was more critical than it really was. I've since tried to challenge that narrative when I hear it. I once believed a lot more of Guns, Germs and Steel's arguments without even recognizing them for what they were, and I can change that now. You may be wondering how the book managed to captivate people if it has all these flaws, and the simplest answer is that it sounds smart while being approachable. For contrast, here's a section from one of the reviews I cited. As the two conceptual dichotomies that define the West, qua West, consolidated in the 19th century, not the hardest to read, but I'd say needlessly obtuse. I want to make fun of how he uses the word explicate like 6 times, but I'm probably guilty of that kind of stuff too. Point being, the competition, so to speak, are often far more inscrutable than this book that claims to explain 13,000 years of history with one determinist theory. Diamond's narrative was, for a time, widely accepted, easily digestible as it is, and sure, the title makes it sound like it's going to be all about guns, germs, and steel, and not extremely fixated on geographic determinism theories that went out of fashion in the mid-20th century, but even with that misdirection, it's still just indirectly confirming what the readership was already taught to believe, that it was all inevitable. But times have changed since 1997 when the book came out, and so should our perceptions. Now the question becomes, does Europa Universalis do all this? Model all this? Arguably, no. Yes, development costs and attrition are higher in the tropics, for example, and travel takes longer in mountain provinces, but those things are immaterial in the face of the actual game mechanics that stunt the ROTW nations, mechanics which, mind you, have changed over the decades span of development. Eurasia's only east-west axis diffusion benefit as far as divergence is concerned is found in institutions. The Renaissance will eventually creep into Asia. The game cannot account easily for hundreds of years of divergence, and converging in parity of power ultimately means converging with Western models of society, the thing the game itself is made to model. That's not to say geography does not have a hard-coded impact on the game, but it's a mixed bag. For one, trade goods are static in the settled world, but it's not like the new world is just all wool and destined to be valueless. And tangentially, the goods can be things like coffee even when settled by Mesoamericans. That's one of those old foundation elements that tells you who ought to be colonizing and who ought to be colonized. For two, trade nodes are arguably more significant for the consolidation of wealth into the end nodes, which cannot change and are all in Europe. Everything reaches Europe eventually in some predestined manner that isn't actually bound to real-world geography. The trade network setup is not the kind of geographic boon that Diamond would point out because it's obviously arbitrary, or at the least predetermined to produce an outcome, a historical outcome. For three, if we take development to be an abstraction of neither population nor strict land value, because there are problems with both of those, we can instead understand it as a deterministic tool. Provinces having initial development values, irrespective of settlement and player investment, makes them a manifestation of environmental determinism itself. This also serves a historical outcome to some extent. It motivates the player to colonize specific provinces, to aim for ones with high dev, even if they lack other enticing geographic features. A fun contrast here is how the game has to uniquely limit the potential of China, the Ming, because otherwise they would probably dominate every game given their starting development and wealth. And the fun of that is how it mirrors the often second question that follows why Europe in academic circles, which is why not China? EU4 more meticulously answers why not China than it does why Europe by virtue of dedicated mechanics and events. Regarding why Europe, the game does offer an answer in its mechanics. The nature of institutions has changed from back when tech groups were far more important, but the institutions are themselves all Western concepts presently. But on the point of geography, when it comes to Europe, the game's geography does not get in the way enough. Disease and environmental acclimation do not inhibit the Europeans from, say, conquering the Congo. That isn't modeled as a problem like it is in Victoria 3, a game that features the historical scramble for Africa. Attrition doesn't cut that deep, and even if it did, it wouldn't actually stop the player in the way historical hurdles did the Europeans until the development of antimalarials and quinine. On the note of failure to model hurdles related to logistics, we come back to the conquest of the Americas. Diamond's narrative of the conquests might loosely justify EU4's own absence of native allies, but it does not actually reflect strongly within EU4. Europa Universalis is not drawing from Diamond's historical narrative, because it's a sandbox game, all about deviations and possibilities with only certain specific inevitabilities baked into its mechanics. But EU4 does believe in the supremacy of technology argument. It supposes that the Spanish army should be capable of crushing the natives without aid. And part of why that is because it fails to model logistics. Attrition doesn't matter enough to not put a doom stack in Central America. Logistics don't matter enough to make local alliances worthwhile. At most, sometimes a player might ally the natives to have a staging ground or something, and I suppose that's partly true to history, but the idea of having their actual soldiers is immaterial. Diamond claims it took 168 Spaniards to defeat the Inca, but EU4 can't do that model, nor does it incentivize it, for better and for worse. Let's be generous with one abstraction of this game. The distinction between an on-map presence and an empty colony is not done based on historical arguments, it's done based on character familiarity and the type of gameplay outcome desired. What I mean is that the more famous tribes of North America get map representation and are playable, not that they had a notably more centralized state, or that the others lacked a culture or some such thing. As for gameplay, well, the game wants North America to be about passive encroachment by the Europeans and Central America and the Inca to be violent conquest, because that's the historical narrativization we expect. Paradox isn't presenting empty land in this instance. They're making it so the Europeans can do what they did in North America at first, which is just kind of show up and build settlements. The colonize button is an abstraction that looks less violent than it is, but it is appropriately passive, appropriate to the popular narrativization. Disease in EU4 is represented by a brutal modifier, but they can't make it too devastating with mass losses in development because that would be, to use a professional term, not fun. I'd argue that the base game was more attached to guns, germs, and steel than the latter iterations, after a decade of updates and expansions, but there's still some of that foundational root from base game. Ultimately, EU4 does not get its history from Guns, Germs, and Steel, but it is still inspired by the anthropology and demography side of Diamond's work. Further, it, perhaps inadvertently, creates its own form of environmental determinism. Abstraction is the mechanic by which these inspirations and correlations thrive, and while the new promised depth of EU5 doesn't strictly mean getting away from that inspiration, it offers an opportunity to, or, frankly, could potentially mean modeling the game even closer to the book's arguments. So let's look at the direction it's going. Project Caesar, the unnamed Paradox game that is definitely not, at the very least, the spiritual evolution of Europa Universalis, has a lot going on in terms of changes to granularity and flavor that go beyond national ideas and abstractions. According to Tinto Talk 9, there are hundreds of buildings, and some of them are unique to cultures, to religions, and some even to individual tags, that is, nations. This video is not a dissection of the potential for flavor in the upcoming game, but what we call flavor does bear some scrutiny. To get everyone on the same page, flavor in a map game means a sense of uniqueness to a given play experience. As such, flavor is derived from unique conditions of the playable nation. Geography and religion are two broad things that impact this. Naturally, playing in East Asia feels different from playing in the Holy Roman Empire, but as the game has gone on in its development, more tags have gotten unique ideas and unique missions, with some having full-on unique mechanics not shared with others. All of this is flavor. Sometimes, as with actual food, flavor can be distinct but weak. This was the case for doing a Zoroastrian Persian run back in the day. You'd become this rare religion with distinct ties to the historical idea of Persia and everything, and there wasn't much to do with it. The religion itself wasn't mechanically strong, and the experience it provided wasn't mechanically rich. With that all laid out, you can see how EU5 has positioned itself differently in two ways. One, flavor is dispersed through little things that represent individual cultures more. The hundreds of buildings demonstrate that. Two, the granular system of demography could potentially provide drastic differences between tags. For contrast, if every Dutch miner had the same ideas, then picking between them in EU4 would probably boil down to map color preference or who has a slight edge according to the highly abstract system that is development. But now, the presence of Dutch and Flemish and Wallonian culture in differing measures will mean something. It will create flavor, distinction. And speaking of development, well, EU5 doesn't do it that way. Given one of the design goals is to, quote, avoid abstraction unless necessary, and the obvious interest in modeling that demography presents, it's clear that this will shake things up for the series. And that shakeup has me very interested in how the new world is presented. There's no way it will come out the same way as EU4 unless there's some hyper-assimilation buff for colonial nations. Contrary to what some people might presume, I'm not hiding around the corner with a baseball bat labeled historical inaccuracy, ready to smack the game the second it deviates from history in its model. If anything, I recognize the colossal undertaking that a project like this game is. And so, given that the Tinto Talks are coming out with the idea of getting feedback, well, it's clear they care about the nuance of history, and they care what people have to say about how the game models it all. I'm somewhat hesitant even now in writing this to say that now's the time to tackle the game for its presentation of the Americas. What if next week there's a whole dev diary about it that upends everything I say? Well, I can't delay forever, and talking about it is collaborating on it in some sense, indirect though it may be. By contrasting the game to EU4, contrasting it to Diamond, maybe it'll help articulate the lens the game puts forward from the outset. Do I think, from all this, that the game is destined down the Diamond path? Wait, that sounded cooler than I meant it to. Is EU5 going to be a guns, germs, and steel simulator? That's the question. Of course it strives to cover more than just the Americas, Africa, and apparent disparity. But how does it model those spaces, given the systems it uses to model everything as we know so far? There's a return to the grey map of EU4 for uncolonized provinces, which is, not my favorite. It feels like a backpedal from the Vic3 system, even if that one is imperfect. Colonization will be about passive encroachment, more in line with EU4 than Vic3's dedicated tension model. The game in general, though, seems less hardwired to presume European dominance for the wrong reasons. I'm sure they'll organically come out on top more often than not, of course. It will still be a divergence theory game, but by modeling things like logistics and removing imaginary concepts like hard-coded colonial regions, the more made-up structural benefits Europe gets in-game will take a backseat to more organic ones. Historical ones, if you will. And I presume those won't be geographically deterministic in a Diamond way. Geography will matter in the right ways. In the Navy talk, when mentioning natural harbors, they state, "This also explains why certain locations grew to be important places in history over others." I want to highlight this as an instance where geographic environmental determinism does, in fact, stand up well. Again, geography has an impact, but it needs to be the right kind of impact. Goods are produced by buildings, and while certain provinces obviously have different natural resources, this gives the player more control over the resources of a region without making every province the exact same. Gone are the days of a capital city producing a low-value trade good and that's it. The placement of natural resources and impact of coastal access are what I'd call determinism done right. Provinces should have natural value to them to an extent, but it should be clear what that value is, clearer than whatever high mildev means. Perhaps predictably, the issues I focused on in EU4 are the ones EU5 seeks to correct. If the departure from development and its consequences for population and land value is the first big one, logistics is the second. As per Tinto Talk 23, food and supply and siegers having to leave due to inadequate supply are all mechanics in the upcoming game. Imagine what this does to the conquest of the Americas. This will have an immense impact on the value of native allies, not only because supply lines are stretched thin across the ocean, meaning a smaller army sent to the New World, but also because it means native allies and local food supply will be relevant. Logistics alone will make local alliances very important. The introduction of logistics and food means an extremely significant amount for the Spanish conquests. Having allies in the region will be integral unless the player could pull an extremely swift war or sustain an army that is likely to be a century ahead in tech. This change forces the relevance of native allies from both a supply and a numerical front. If I'm wrong about this, I'll be more disappointed than shocked. As for colonization, the new model will revolve around power projection, that is, relative power between two countries. This is almost a best of both worlds between EU4's desire to model passive encroachment and Victoria 3's map presence and no need for full war declaration. Further, colonial nations are not geographically locked to being New World and Oceania specific. Anyone can form a colonial nation, quote, anywhere on the map where you can colonize. These changes, explicit and implicit within new mechanics, make for a wholly different and more open foundation. With logistics alone, the conquest of the Americas is looking to be radically different. Even if the game shares Diamond's demographic estimate of 20 million people in pre-Columbian America with 95% killed by smallpox by 1600, that's something they'll model that they barely even touched before. A concentration of unique texts in the New World, as described in the 20th talk, is a way to get closer to simulating the disparity in experiences and cultural values of the Native Americans in the European default. Will their gameplay be entirely unique because of it? Maybe. These games prioritize growth and progress narratives in a way that makes it hard to model a society with very different trajectories, to model a culture that values things besides growth. That's just going to be a shortcoming that can, at best, be knowingly worked around. Authentic native play isn't and shouldn't just be waiting for the advent of European violence, but their deviation from history in a model like this will, at best, be a refutation of that violence through adoption of the Western model, or an adoption of the Western model and by extension its historical narratives of success through conquest. Those are the two options I see as likely, but I'm happy to be surprised and not even asking for otherwise. Diamond's work, indeed the concept of Great Divergence itself, presumes that everyone was playing the same game and the Europeans won, and a game like Europa Universalis can only ever really make this same assumption. Ultimately, I cannot speculate too deeply on native play, but a small part of me is wondering how inevitable disease will be for them. Will the Native American cities, will the mound builders down to the Andes with 100 years of play pre-contact have to collapse? Will European contact result in a % chance, a mean time to happen event for their whole population to start rapidly shrinking? The story starting in 1337 no longer means the opening is the age of exploration, no longer is the beginning of the end for the Americas, and while there are biological factors at play, it's almost daunting to imagine it being a hard-coded downfall. It would be the only instance of the game inserting what I can only call a genetic liability into POPs. EU4 has some natural disaster events hard-coded to certain provinces, like 5 for Yangtze River floods, and granted, those don't have some butterfly effect cause that would be prevented by Mughal ownership of China or whatever, and I get why they keep the natural disasters as incontrovertible, but it is strange to see events so far from the start date, the point of historical deviation, just be destined. Disease, of course, was not ignored in EU4, though it had a light hand in native gameplay. A savvy player can largely avoid it, and even at its worst, it makes one's state weaker but does not obliterate one's people. There's a triggered modifier called Rapid Collapse of Society, which is genuinely devastating but can be avoided with an ounce of foresight. Notably, it does not result in the destruction of development. Another face of disease is events like the smallpox one, which can, again, be overcome pretty quickly. EU5 could make it harder to avoid. Maybe native play should border on unfun. They don't want to turn it into some miserable lesson on the plight of the Americans because it's still a game, but that doesn't mean it should avoid the hardship. And I wouldn't read too deeply into the ease of removal as the game saying anything. It's not like EU4 makes the argument, lol, why didn't the natives just deb for institutions, you know? As for Diamond's influence, well, EU4 took Diamond's insistence that tech was the main edge, and I partly suspect the modeling of disease will lean towards Diamond's other insistence that disease was the main factor, and a passive one at that. Dimed if you do, diamond if you don't, or something. Look, I'm not clever. The inclusion of demography and disease can easily be tweaked. Those numbers and their impacts can be inspired by GGS or they can be shifted. I don't expect Paradox would tweak population numbers with every new study, every new groundbreaking book that comes out on life in pre-Columbian America, but the system itself is both richer and more amenable to change. This winds us back to the question of what development represents in EU4 and how, in turn, EU5 won't just be modeling something differently, but with whole new tools to express history. As it stands for EU4, with population not existing, the Americas lose no value in conquest and the implied depopulation through disease and war. The new emphasis on population also serves European history, of course. As it stands in 4, the sack of a city just gives a bit of devastation, where in real life, something like the sack of Magdeburg destroyed close to 80% of its buildings. 20,000 people were killed in the sack. That's going to matter a lot more to a player than like, oops, this one province is going to give me fewer duckies for a few ticks. Much the same in the New World. The player doesn't land a colony in Massachusetts and watch the development shrink. Provinces retain their value. Further, this will make the triangle trade more than just an offhand event that changes the price of slaves and into a real thing that's modeled as the New World incorporates slave populations from Africa. For another example of history that population can present, we have the Spanish caste system and all the ways they could represent that in demographics, how that might force the uncomfortable question of ethnicity into POPs. I could see it being something more EU4 style, not modeled but told to the player by events and modifiers, or the Victoria 3 route of being implicitly modeled by cultural acceptance laws but not very fleshed out, or maybe they'll find the best of both worlds here. And that's all without even getting into the question of what interpretation they go for with respect to the Spanish caste system, how rigid and real they make it. Point being, EU5 by nature of modeling populations cannot be the same. In introducing population, EU5 closes the distance created by time, if only a little. These games are championed for their ability to get people to think like a ruler in the given time period, to immerse in some way. Population modeling during a time of violent demographic change will hit differently. Not to drag up the other "is this a bad guy" button question in discussing the convert province culture button, but this is a feature that will also fade away with EU5. With people modeled, not only would there be no magic button that changes a province culturally, but also, provinces won't be absolute. No longer will a province be absolutely Mayan, absolutely Dutch, absolutely Castilian. And in that, the fault Diamond had of ignoring the persistence of a people post-conquest is, in some sense, undone. Complexity here allows for a better, richer depiction of history. And from that, I'm not saying it'll become a feel-bad about history simulator or that it will unintentionally play out a Sepulvedas versus Las Casas debate or something, but the effects of colonial actions will inevitably be more apparent to the player. History will be less clean in EU5. If we understand Jared Diamond's thesis to be one of geographic environmental determinism with certain incorrect historical narrativizations and the occasional disputed or inaccurate number, then EU5 is definitely poised to avoid him. I do think Guns, Germs and Steel was an inspiration for EU4, and I do think it will continue to have a degree of influence, at the very least on the lens by which many players interpret the game. If the systems of EU5 are interlocking enough to influence each other, then of course warfare will make food supply worse, and if they make disease more rampant in places with famine, then they will indirectly do a better job than Diamond did in exploring germs. And in the example of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, EU5 has the potential to add a lot of complexity to the depiction. EU4 makes it too simple. It makes many things too simple, and in this specific case, simplification makes the same mistakes Diamond does, the same overtly easy and ultimately incorrect understandings of the conquests that people have had to question and unlearn. Europa Universalis 5 will do better history because it has better tools with which to show history. Times have changed since 2013 when EU4 came out, since update after update, since the New World emphasizing DLCs of 2014, 2015, and 2021, and now 2024 even. But foundationally, EU4 is stuck in an old understanding of history. EU5 can correct its course, but the question then is if it wants to, if the developers are making themselves aware of the new understandings of history, or if they'll fall into making a Guns, Germs and Steel simulator. Even if they never adhered to its strict historical mistellings, GGS is an inspiration. Let's take a final critique of Diamond and apply the parallel to EU4. Diamond's geographic determinism is often accused of going too far in how much it credits geography for the Divergence. But that's not to say there is no value in exploring geography and its impacts. Much of the same, EU4 is deterministic in its geography, and sometimes in ways that make sense, like province terrain and trade good, kinda, and sometimes in ways that are more arbitrary, like the density of provinces, which affects the ability to develop greater, and in the natural development of provinces themselves. So long as development remains abstract, it cannot simulate anything. It can only tilt the game towards the outcome history expects, and that's not the same as simulation. EU5 is poised to change that. Geography will, of course, play a significant role in EU5, and it could even play a painfully determinist role to the chagrin of players. It might be difficult to surmount, but at the least, it isn't a pile of predetermined ideal provinces mired in abstraction. In a truly ironic way, the deterministic qualities of Diamond's book are the exact thing that simulations are built on. In the most cynical reads of Diamond as a complete geographic determinist, if history were to run again and again and again, it would produce near the same results. EU4 wouldn't do exactly that, but it would follow the broad strokes all the same. The player and the player's agency is the only thing that can cause the more monumental upsets, because the game lacks a modeling of human agency. And with Diamond, arguing he advocates extreme determinism is to say he argues against human agency. And a world without human agency is more or less what EU4 feels like. It's a world of states that all singularly desire expansion when given the opportunity. EU5, in inviting pops into being, in chasing away development, changes the face of play, inviting a more human presence in the story of human history than EU4 could bear. Even if these games are still just spreadsheets with graphics. Whew, it's been a while. Hi. Oops. I posted about it a bit, but life events made working on this one a challenge, and then I got sick and whatever. It's done now. Hopefully worth the wait. Next time should be early, mid next month, and it will be Inscription. I don't want to have a 70+ day gap between videos again. Even if there's a reason for it, it still feels bad. Thanks for being incredibly patient. Also, thanks to Lady Saffron, who provided a voice line for JM Blout. If you like streamers who are good at streaming and being engaged, and you happen to have a positive answer to the ethical question of VTubers, I recommend her content. And then of course, thanks to all the patrons. The support is well appreciated, especially in the face of a lapse in videos. In particular, this time we have John Orsa, Cesare Mikua, Daniel Indicator, Defender, Franz Johannes Feulner, Galactic Beyond, Gilded Dragon, Isaac Hampton, Isaac of Lyria, Lissing FMA, Mark Soto, Michael Kelly, Nick, Nitopir, Nweed Swamp, Queen Naked Molerat, Sipper Turnipsy, and Avicii Ray. Please let me know if I missed you. It turns out when I don't update my internal list for a while, I get messy on keeping track of who should be on it. I can't wait for this game to actually come out, not only for my own enjoyment, but because I have a strong feeling that it'll be a great opportunity to talk about the idea of estates and social class through the ages. So I guess that's it. It feels weird to say bye again after having been away for a long time, but, bye. $874 geopolitics, playing geopolitics with my little Dutch boys. Why am I saying words?